computer. There we go. So we're recording this session now. So this is the first of two plenary sessions where we will be focusing on the first four of the paper sessions. And the agenda is that each of the chairs will give a quick rundown on the papers in their session and any observations about how their session went. Following that, we'll have a general discussion of issues related to the topics that have come up, and then we'll finish off with an incubator session where we'll discuss some ideas for future research. So let's begin with the introductions of the sessions by the chairs, starting with Peter Jordan. Thank you, Peter.
Thanks, Neil. I've come prepared. In other words, I've taken notes, but Neil suggested about 5 minutes for this, given I gave each of the people 5 minutes to talk, and I've just spent 30 minutes or 30 seconds explaining what's going on. Doing justice to the full papers in that period of time, I'm not going to be able to do. I'd suggest you have a look at the videos if you haven't already seen the videos, but I'll just go through them quickly. Eleanor had an excellent presentation looking at the effects of feedback and the impact of emotions on feedback. It was quite an interesting study. She apologised about the size of the sample, but it was 90 dyads, which I thought was extremely respectable. Experimental design, they actually had a design where the leaders were given training. There was a control group. There was a cognitive feedback group, which focused on the cognitive aspects of feedback. There was an affective focus for one group about affective issues being positive in feedback and so on. And then there was one in which they were combined. And then they sort of tested those with observational measures looking at the leaders. Interestingly, there was no direct effects from the training. They found no direct effects from the training. They then sort of tested whether authenticity made a difference, and there was a test of the Duchenne smile versus sort of smiling, and they found no effects there either. And one of the questions that came out was, do you actually want your leader to give you a Duchenne smile when you're getting feedback? And sometimes it may not be the right thing. And so, you know, the interesting thing was that there was an effective positivity on followers, but most of the, and about specificity, but most of the others sort of fell over. So she's in the process of sort of reworking that data and so on. So that was an interesting presentation on feedback. We had Basil give us a talk about emotion in organisations, and he had an interesting combination. It was a cross-sectional study where he was actually looking at the dual impact of workaholism and gratitude on job behaviour. He talked through and sort of justified why gratitude and workaholism were his focal constructs as mediators. And he looked, his independent variables were the big five: job characteristics, and oh God, I can't read my own writing. But yeah, so he's undertaken this study of people. He's looking to sort of take it through to publication. He hadn't actually got to the point of sorting out a publication venue at this stage, but we gave him a lot of feedback, which we hope was helpful around procedure and the sample and so on, to try and enhance the quality of that study. The final paper was one by Dan Lungerite. Dan's one of my PhD students working on entitlement in the workplace. And this was a conceptual paper, and the conceptual paper was basically arguing a difference between how high-performing employees and low-performing employees respond in terms of their entitlement. So we used Tamir's motives for emotion regulation and suggested that high-performing employees use instrumental methods, and that might enhance their job satisfaction, whereas low-performing employees tend to use hedonic methods, and that wouldn't necessarily contribute to sort of good outcomes. And the reason that high-performing employees have got or focus on instrumental emotion regulation methods is because they've actually got something to argue for higher sort of rewards and outcomes. And so we got some good feedback from the audience there about sort of theoretical models that we were using and looking to enhance those. So I think that's my 5 minutes of fame and plus a
Very
bit.
nice.
Maybe.
Thank you very much, Peter. Sharman only had 2 papers in her session. Unfortunately, we had our only withdrawal in her session. So emotions and human resources.
Yes. Can everyone hear me okay?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, it was a little bit also technologically fraught. Moments just moments after the session commenced, the first presenter's microphone broke, and he couldn't then communicate with us at all, and so we weren't able to sort of immediately resolve that. So what I basically did was flip the order of the papers, and then just to kind of give you a view of the technological thing, we were actually very lucky that one of the participants in the audience happened to be a friend of Justin, and so was able and knew his email, and emailed and said, "Oh, I'll take your slides," and knew about his research, and so was able to get his slides, which fortunately Justin had already put a voiceover on. So we were at least able to play that, but Justin couldn't actually communicate with us. He did stay in the session, so and I did get him both an apology afterwards, but he also said he really found the conversation useful. So that kind of in that context, I'll give you a little bit of information on sort of what happened. So I'll discuss Justin's paper first, even though it was because that was the order it was meant to go in, although it was presented second. So Justin's paper was on job crafting, and what was I thought was quite interesting about this paper was that it was talking about job crafting as either being approach job crafting or avoidance job crafting, and sort of looking at kind of the, sort of emotional sort of responses and the like under that, and how coworkers essentially responded to that. Now, the way that was set up, because he used kind of, scenarios in which he tested it. So it was a very, on the one hand, that's lovely because it's nice experimental control and the like, and found a very neat relationship showing, if it was approach, the coworkers like it, if it was avoidance, they didn't like it, this sort of thing. So in the discussion, I had a very quiet audience. So pretty much I did all the talking. I was the discussant. Pretty much no one asked anything. So I'm not exactly sure why that was. I tried to coax them. I offered the chat, but it just didn't happen much. So one of the things I did do in that one, and fortunately his colleague had shared research a bit, and also was doing job crafting research, was happy to get in a kind of a discussion with me. So it actually ended up being a bit interesting. But one of the things I raised with it was, again, and which I think was, I would say generally reflecting on both papers in this session, is that they, I felt that one of the things that was missing is a little bit more of a nuanced perspective on perhaps the findings, the generalizability, even the realism of them. So one of the things I said is firstly, given my own organizational experience in both private, public, and university sectors, my view is that most people do both avoidance and approach job crafting. That it's not like you just pick one or the other and that's all you do. So for one, I think that was sort of one of the things that sort of I mentioned, is that a little more nuance there of realizing people may do that, and the other thing is that in some cases that, you know, really, I mean, I can personally think of examples where, you know, approach job crafting could piss off coworkers, and that I can also think of instances where avoidance job crafting wouldn't piss your coworkers off. You know, so I think that if you looked at it, thinking about more nuance around that, and it largely depends on what the impact of that is on your sort of coworkers. The other thing, of course, is that in many cases, the way that organizations these days, we are often given far more activities to do than is humanly possible to do within our workday. And I think being an academic is a great example. And so all of us have to, in our prioritization of various tasks, we sort of have to think about what are the things that are much, much more important, and some things that you know, are not quite as important. And part of that means that you're going to be also involved a bit in both of these, again, the approach job crafting or avoidance job crafting. And I think largely if others in the organization will, if they kind of both understand and see that you're actually delivering on the key objectives of the organization and understanding that larger context, that would be effective. So that was kind of, as I said, his colleague got very excited because he was also working on job crafting research and said, oh, I think that's exactly right. And so we had a little bit of a lively discussion. So that was nice. And then the other paper, which was by Jing Bu presented. And this was also another really interesting idea. So I thought both papers had some real novel kind of, you know, ideas in them. So Xing Bu was really using self-determination theory, and then he looked at this idea of, he was interested in looking at creative behavior. So he's interested in looking at affect under need satisfaction and affect under need thwarting. And again, this is, I think, is sometimes people forget about that their study design creates certain constraints that is part of the reason for your finding. Okay, so in this case, again, a neat finding of, you know, when affect under need satisfaction was, you know, related to higher creativity than, you know, under need thwarting to creativity. Okay. And again, I think this is, certainly there would be conditions where this is the case, and this would be, but I also think it's somewhat a part of the sort of study design. So one of the things, again, with very little comment from the audience, but I did ask Jing and about, could there be types of creativity that would be supported by need thwarting? Now, of course, as an organization, you don't really want to do, it's not like you want to thwart people's needs to make them more creative. But I thought it was a, you know, to me, it was kind of that interesting theoretical question. And he agreed that that was a possibility. Part of the reason, you know, that came to mind is we all know about, you know, the Vincent van Goghs, you know, the distressed, sort of lost, kind of the artistic types that hardly are, you know, feeling that all their needs are satisfied. They feel very much distressed that they're not getting needs fulfilled in life. So that was really, again, about looking at what I would say our discussions were more around boundary conditions of what some of the studies were saying, and thinking about potentially context where that the finding might be different. Okay. And again, it's not about suggesting organizations should thwart people's needs, but understanding that some of this is because of both our study designs, and there certainly could be other types of conditions. So it's not quite as simple and linear of relationships. And I would sum it up as that. But yeah, I thought they were really interesting papers, and you know, I would love to have, of course, had a lot of discussion, and it would have been great if we didn't have the technological problems.
That's all right.
There.
Sounds like some interesting papers, though. All right. So thank you very much for that.
Yeah, really so.
So Audrey, you were chairing the next session that had 4 papers.
Yes, I facilitated the session on emotions in abuse and incivility. And most of the work in my session were very conceptual and theoretical. So 4 papers, I really like and enjoy how authors from my session were so interactive and actively making connections in their papers during the live session. And they were examining similar concepts like justice and ethical behaviors or unethical behaviors. So the first one was Ashley's paper. Ashley did this with Peter as well and Alana. So what we typically find in the literature are the ones that relate the behavioral attempts of responding to abusive supervisors and not so much of emotional attempts. So Ashley and Alana and Peter, they use the emotional labor framework in looking at subordinate authenticity of emotional expressions, whether authentic or fake, and in particular emotions of joy and anger, using Glom's and Chew's deals in response to abusive supervision. So through 4 waves of data collection, their paper also examined the performance outcomes of heartfelt versus fake emotional expressions of employees, and in particular, task proficiency and adaptivity, that's right. And they found that while people who fake emotional responses in dealing with abusive supervision, there are also individuals who actually show what they feel when they encounter abusive supervision. And both authentic and fake emotions predicted task performance in their work. I think their work supports the notion that individuals do consciously and deliberately regulate their emotions at work, and in that, abusive supervision leads to subordinates faking of emotions and joy and anger specifically. I think this paper provides an empirical support to Tamir's taxonomy. Was it done in 2015 or 2016?
2015.
2015, right. The next one, it's a very interesting paper, very conceptual, by Mark Ohana, who examined individuals' poor sleep quality after being treated unfairly by their colleagues. It's interesting how he linked justice and sleep in his model. So he used the role of negative affect as the mediator for interpersonal justice with sleep quality, and then suggested that dispositional optimism moderates the relationship between justice and negative affect. And Mark made a very clear distinction that the source of justice is actually the co-workers. So he did 10 consecutive days of diary studies and managed to collect over 1,400 data from 300 employees. It's a very robust, it's very robust, I think. And he did SEM and then used CFA to examine the construct validity of the variables. So the next paper by Hongguo Wei, Xiaobing Li, and Yusha Zhu Hongguo presented a very comprehensive model of leader compassionate but unethical behavior, and how it has an impact on subordinates' unethical behavior through a sense-making process. So yeah, she started off by asking why good leaders do bad things, and they do for various reasons. I think for this paper, she came up with a very comprehensive model that took about 26 minutes for her presentation. So I suggest everyone to go see that presentation. She came all the way down to quadrants, and each quadrant are each one is very well explained. So I'm just going to summarize this. They argue that the subordinate's interpretation of the supervisor's behavior has an impact on subordinates' unethical behaviors through the reshaping of his or her affective reactions and moral self. You've got to see the model. The way she constructed it is so nice. The reshaping of emotions, it fits so nicely in between that. The next paper, the last one by Shima Tara, she presented her work on volunteering as a coping strategy of incivility, which is also a theoretical model. Same. I think you have to see the whole explanation through the presentation. I'm just going to summarize this one. She used catharsis theory, which I think it's kind of interesting, which assumes that viewing or acting a similar emotion that one is suffering can help. It's purgation. So on the contrary, in the present study, she proposed that helping others can help in purgation of stress. So that's about it. I strongly suggest everyone go view the videos. It's very detailed as compared to my summary.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Audrey. That was a great summary. And the last of the sessions we're including in today's plenary is the one that was chaired by Ron on emotional labour.
All right. Let me see if I could just share the abstracts, because that would help guide my discussion here. Okay. Can everyone see that?
Yep. Make it a bit bigger if you want. Maybe get rid of the navigation panel, Ron.
Make it. Oh.
Click on that little X there.
All right. All right. Okay.
There we go. And make it a bit bigger.
Yeah, I get
that's
the.
All right. That's I can read it.
Sure, let's just zoom in. Let's go. Let's see what that does.
There we go.
Is that better?
Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, first off, I'd like to just go over how pleased I was with the way this ran. And when we had to switch from the physical conference located here in Lancaster University to the virtual conference, I sort of had three concerns. And the first was, our ability to sort of network and make connections with other people, because like Peter Jordan said, this is sort of like a conference without the booze, a conference without the chance to just sort of have drinks and get to know each other. And so I thought, it's sort of dull, when you're missing the interpersonal interaction, to me is what's so exciting about attending conferences and making connections. And I got a wonderful example of the value of attending conferences right in my session, because one of the presenters, Jim, said he had met his co-authors on his current paper from a prior Emonet. And so I thought, yeah, that shows people do make connections. They do develop these research ties. And of course, Neil and I met at the very first Emonet conference years ago, and now we are publishing a lot together. And of course, I've met Peter and Ashley, who's working with me now too at the conferences. And so conferences really are a great way to make connections, discover make new co-authors, and just keep our enthusiasm for working on our lonely topics alive, so the first thing I did was have everyone introduce themselves. And I found that to me, it really seemed like people were making connections, and that we did have a sense of getting to know each other. And I feel I do know our presenters somewhat, that I got a feel for their personalities, and hopefully they got a little bit of a feel for who I am also. And so I did really enjoy the sort of chit chat we engaged in at the beginning of the session. And so, because at a regular conference that could go on for quite some time. And so we had everyone introduce each other. And so and I thought that worked out pretty well. And then it turned out like some of the presenters had two of the presenters had previously worked in sales and had considerable sales experience, and that was informing their research on emotional labor. We had other presenters and members of the audience who had worked in healthcare, and so they understood the articles on emotional labor in healthcare settings. And I think people could see how they could had a lot of similarities that could maybe be the basis for some joint research projects in the future as well. The second concern I had is with this virtual format is people watch the paper separately, the PowerPoint slides and the presentation separately, and then we're supposed to have the discussion session. And in a typical conference, you have maybe about an hour worth of people presenting, like 3 20-minute presentations, and then half an hour of discussion. And so you're seeing the presentation and then immediately discussing it, which for people like me, that it's still in my short-term memory. I can ask an informed question 5 minutes later, maybe, but so I was wondering, are we going to have any discussion at all? When maybe people watched the video a day or two ago, are you still going to be able to remember it in the sort of level of detail necessary to ask an insightful question? And so I was very pleased with just how informed the members of the audience were, and the level of detail that they were able to engage in discussion with the presenters. And I know Andrea, who was very actively engaged, and of course she's doing a special issue for a journal on emotional labor and service quality, so she was being very engaged with it. I know Anne, who's had to chair her own session, was also extremely knowledgeable about all the papers, and so were many other members of the audience. So I really appreciated that, and I thought this format actually worked pretty well, that people were perhaps able to watch the presentations at their own speed, maybe review parts that they didn't understand, and had time to think about some perceptive discussion questions before we actually went into this symposium. And so I was actually quite pleased with the quality of the discussion. And the third concern I had was, I was thinking, well, we're giving a whole hour to the discussion. Well, maybe in a lot of prior conferences, you might have 20 or 30 minutes allocated to it. And sometimes the discussion session ends after 10 minutes. The chair's trying to prod people to come up with a discussion. But our session was supposed to last for an hour. It lasted for an hour and 25 minutes. And so there's just so much enthusiasm. Without even having had the paper presentation, we had about an hour and a half discussion, counting about half an hour introductions and so forth. So that concern that we would all end after 5 minutes, that didn't happen. We had some really fantastic discussion. So let me just real briefly give some highlights of the 4 papers that we had. And the first paper was by Michael Klein, a conceptual framework of research themes and future direction for a frontline employee, customer interpersonal exchange approach to emotional labor. And so I'd had the pleasure of having Michael in the doctoral consortium earlier. And so I had already heard him go over some of his research. And in this session, he's presenting his conceptual model. And in the doctoral consortium, he presented his empirical study, which gave some great support to his conceptual model. So I got to actually see the key results earlier, which were fantastic. And so quite innovative. And so and so a good examination of emotional labor for frontline employees and customers, looking at issues such as customer rudeness towards the service provider and things like that. Okay, and then the second paper by Jim McCluskey and his colleagues here was on the Joseph and Newman's cascading model of emotional labor, which Joseph and Newman did a meta-analysis of the relationship between emotional intelligence and job performance. And in that, they developed a model about how the 4 dimensions of the Mayer and Slovy model of ability emotional intelligence, sort of one dimension predicts another dimension. Like the first dimension is you have to first recognize emotions before you can like regulate emotions. And so they had this sort of cascading model, which showed some support in their meta-analysis. And then they also argued that the emotional labor requirements of the jobs would all act as an important moderator of the emotional intelligence job performance relationship. And so Jim in his literature review went over 4 other publications that had tested this model, the cascading model of emotional intelligence. And then his own study showed pretty good support that he found the 4 dimensions did have this cascading effect. And he also improved upon the model or expanded the research by looking at, instead of just categorizing occupations as high or low in emotional labor demands, which is what Joseph and Newman did, he looked at the degree to which they were using surface acting or deep acting. So in that sense, I think it was a very important expansion. And then he also had a very interesting extension as well, which is that instead of using job performance as the dependent variable, he was looking at leadership effectiveness, which is not even highlighted in his title here. And I've been trying to pioneer a concept of leader emotional intelligence and leader emotional labor. So I've been writing articles on how leaders use emotional labor. So I found this article very important for that regard as well, and perhaps needs to emphasize in his article, the value, the relevance of all this to leadership research. Of course, he had so much to talk about that perhaps he could do even more with that or write a second article on it. So fantastic study here. And then the next study is Emotional Labor on the Ward by Rebecca Dickerson. And so here she's looking at emotional labor in hospitals. And so the healthcare setting has always been one where there's been a lot of research on emotional labor, because the hospitals and healthcare settings are settings where there are some extreme and intense emotions. You've got life and death settings. You've got people worried about their own health. They're worried about the health of their loved ones. Perhaps it's an emergency room and people are in a panic. And so looking at emotional labor in healthcare settings, it's a very appropriate setting. And one of the main contributions that Rebecca made in her paper here is taking a multi-level perspective to the study of emotional labor. And so she was looking at these emotional display rules through this multi-level perspective. And I think that adds a lot of value to her article. And of course, she was looking at 2 different types of healthcare services, also long-term care units and medical emergency units. And so again, that adds value to her study because she's looking at 2 different contexts. Long-term care units, we have the chance to develop relationships with the patients, and then that immediate medical emergency with those intense emotions there. And so fantastic paper there. And the group matters, linking group identification and intergroup conflict to emotional labor strategies is by our next set of authors here. And so they're mostly from the University of Valencia in Spain, which is exactly what I thought when I saw the first author's name, Dragana Nedeljkovic. I thought Spanish, yes. No. Anyway, Dragana is actually graduating today. This is the last day in her master's program, so congratulations to her for that. So a very impressive paper, first authored by a master's student. So I was trying to encourage her to go on and get a PhD. I think she certainly has done a fantastic job here. And so this paper is also innovative in that it's linking group identification and intergroup conflict to emotional labor. So here you've got two sort of major contributions, this paper, linking the identification processes to emotional labor. So that's a major contribution. And then also linking intergroup conflict to emotional labor. So again, a big expansion of the domain of emotional labor research. And so, so I think quite an innovative study. They had a good sample size of 141 participants and 48 groups of 3 members. Here they're able to subject 28 of the groups to intergroup conflict. Good luck getting that through the ethics approval process here at Lancaster. Anyway, she found this negative relationship between group identification and surface acting. And so the more you identify with your group, the more authentic you're going to be and the less likely you're going to engage in surface acting. So that's an important finding. And there's a positive interaction between group identification and deep acting. So you're going to really try and summon up the appropriate feelings when you identify with your group members. And so then, of course, intergroup conflict also influence the type of emotional labor strategies that you used and moderated the relationship between group identification and group acting. So all 4 papers in the session had a major contribution to make to the research on emotional labor. They all fit very well together because they were all really focused on emotional labor. So I really enjoyed the session.
Thanks very much, Ron. Okay, so now is the opportunity for anybody to raise any points, any general points, or if you have any specific points about any of the papers that we've been discussing for the last 45 minutes, 40 minutes. Any broad issues that you spotted? And then we'll sort of roll over to our next thing. What's some future research so we can keep this going within the context of what's come out of these papers. What struck me is we've got a long way to go, guys. We really do, because I think across all of the sessions, the authors were able to delve into well-established areas and to expand and extend the theories. Did anybody notice that was happening right across all of the papers? People were taking what we knew, because the research has been going on for 25 years now. 30 years if we go from Ashforth and Humphrey, I guess. That's where it all started. 1995, 25 years. Yeah, so, sorry, 25 years it is. Yeah, but we're already still coming up with new ideas. Somebody want to expand upon that line?
Neil,
I mean, I thought the session I was in was a great example of expanding concepts we've been studying to whole new areas like intergroup conflict, identification processes, sales effectiveness, service effectiveness. I mean, as opposed to just stress and emotional labor.
Peter, you were saying something?
Yeah. I was going to say one of the things that struck me is the static way we look at emotions, and I think Sharman sort of mentioned it in her presentation, and certainly it came out in mine, is that, you know, emotional responses are most effective if they're actually flexible responses. So a static response doesn't actually get you too far, but what we end up researching basically are very static responses rather than flexible responses. And I don't know if I've got a solution for picking up the flexibility, but certainly it fits into the Michelle and Shoda stuff about the importance of context fitting into the things we do. And maybe we need more consideration of context when we're doing some of our research.
Thanks for that, Peter.
And I was going to say some of the papers today actually pick some of that up. And I think it's interesting that it's moving from mostly quantitative methods, which perhaps makes it much more rigid because you're only looking at constructs that you're measuring at the time. Whereas with quite a lot of qualitative research coming in, that helps bring in some of that flexibility. But I was also impressed that actually it's moving into more work-based research rather than so many student studies, except in the first stage to see if something works. So I thought it was some really interesting papers and some more to come. So I shall look forward to this evening or tomorrow morning for you.
So some other ideas for some directions for future research that we're seeing out of these studies? Especially like the application of the Joseph and Newman ideas to apply to leadership. I mean, that's quite a significant extension of that area and something that I hadn't thought of applying before. So I think there's many opportunities for taking research that has been applied across at the employee level and taking it up to that leadership level, because leaders are just people after all.
The other thing I thought, actually, Rebecca answered a question I asked her extremely well about the issues of the current situation. You know, there is certainly something to say when there's a global event that we all have to respond to. The impact on emotions might be interesting. You know, sort of the whole issue of how do you do emotional labor when you're covered in PPE.
Absolutely. Excellent suggestion. Yes, and I'm sure a lot of research is going to go, because all of the research. Well, there we go.
Very good, Ron.
All of the research funding bodies are pushing this line of making money available for COVID-related research.
Yeah, I know. I mean, I was just thinking if we turn our attention to the COVID situation, I mean, okay, in terms of the emotions affect, the big problem is not while we're in the throes of the pandemic, because there is all attention, all resources, you know, clapping the emergency services and nurses and, you know, health professionals. It's like, you know, a big, wonderful, loving world. But the problem, I think the real problem isn't going to, in terms of emotion and affect, it's actually going to be after we come out of this. After we're out of it and we sort of go back to, you know, what we consider at least post-COVID normal, when we're back into normal things, we're then going to forget about the sort of impacts that this has had on people's lives. There's going to not be that sort of focal attention. It's going to be like, you know, everybody, okay, it's over, come on, get back to work, soldier on, you know, stiff upper lips, all these sorts of things. And I think that, you know, I hope that there will be some continued attention to providing some resources to research on this topic when we come out of this, because I think that's where we're going to see a lot of the issues arise is in the aftermath, not in the midst of it. You know, this is when everybody, you know, we all pull together. It's like the Queensland floods, you know, the mud army, and people were like community building and feeling like, great, you know, we're all something special. But when it's over, I think that's when we're going to see a lot of issues, and it does concern me that, you know, that a lot of people's attention will turn away from that, and there will be, but I think there will be a lot of devastating impact that comes out of this in the aftermath.
I think you're quite right, and perhaps part of our role could be how do we lock in the sort of new, what we learned from it in terms of keeping some research going, and how we build the new normal, so building in those lessons.
And I think, I mean, to build on this is one of the things, and, you know, I would love to see, and we have had examples of this over the last number of, you know, Emonets and in the field, but I'd like to see a lot more of this. Is I think we need to continue, you know, try to increase our focus on interventions. Yeah. What can we do to support, you know, sort of the kind of things like the, you know, whether it's the well-being, the resilience, the sort of the you know, kind of the all the things we know about in terms of what helps people to kind of move on in a healthy way in their lives. And as communities, what can we as emotion researchers do to be able to kind of put some of those sorts of things, identify some of those kinds of practices, interventions, try to then, you know, disseminate this out there to not just organizations, policymakers, communities. I would like to see us do more in that space of actual interventions and what we can do to support, sort of, you know, put our stuff into action, I guess, for good.
Yeah, I think that makes a really good agenda, part of a good agenda, Neil. Sort of having that.
Yeah, yeah. I'm part of a £9 million National Institute of Health Research grant, which when we awarded the grant, I naively assumed I would have some millions to pass around, but unfortunately not. What it really shows is that this money is used to coordinate a group of over 70 healthcare units and three different universities, and then support further grant development on issues. But right now, I'm preparing to submit this week a paper on COVID-19 anxiety and emotional intelligence. And so, so in this article, this paper, we argue that that unlike other flu pandemics, there's two crises from this. You know, one is the health crisis and all the emotional anxiety that COVID-19 brings out in both healthcare workers, regular workers on the job, and consumers. And then there's the financial crisis, which, unlike other flu pandemics, there wasn't a similar financial crisis. And trying to restart the economy, as Charmin's pointing out, is this aftermath. Is, you know, it's sort of like an egg. Once you break that economic egg, trying to put all those pieces back together, it's like Humpty Dumpty. And so I am arguing that emotional intelligence and training in emotional intelligence can help with all this, because key to reopening the economy is getting workers comfortable to working with each other again. And yet we've had here in the UK over 100 days of lockdown where many workers were not allowed to even go into their jobs. They're told, you know, if you go to your jobs, you could catch COVID-19 and die. All right, so now you're supposed to say, go back, work with your colleagues, customers, come on into the restaurants, don't worry about catching a dread disease and kicking the bucket. So training people in how to manage this COVID-19 anxiety, I think is going to be part of the recovery process, that helping people recover from this anxiety. And I know in the UK, and I imagine in the US and Australia, well, Australia wasn't hit so bad because you guys were smart. you stopped the spread pretty fast. But there's fears that
it helps to be an island, Ron.
It helps to be an island, yeah.
UK's an island.
Yeah, but
didn't help them much.
it's far too easy to get to. It's a lot harder to get to us, and you got a lot of great white sharks to pass through to get here.
That's right.
Well, we had a prime minister who skipped the first 5 meetings of our the crisis committee that was supposed to be dealing with the COVID-19. So while
and then he caught it himself and nearly died.
Yeah, then he caught it and nearly died.
And he still hasn't learnt the lessons.
Yeah, but
if only we could have Jacinda. Roy, can you send her over?
I think we're going to keep her, but I think what we have seen, in fact, some academics were very fast out of the gate while I wouldn't say putting the finishing touches, but it was the due date for the conference papers was kind of in the early stages of lockdown. Already after about 2 weeks, there were academic studies, how they got it out so quickly, that was quite well researched, kind of overviews of things and looking up existing research within 2 weeks, kind of like early May, let's say, there were papers that were already coming out. Also some other research projects that I was involved in that had nothing to do with COVID, but had to do with flexibility, working from home, and all of a sudden, that's what happened. And studies I've been involved in that colleagues were running before, that I joined later, they were, well, the companies themselves then started, as part of the survey that we and my colleagues had put together, started adapting that, and the kind of things like workplace support and emotional support, let alone the sort of instrumental practical support was already happening. So the next phase of the survey or the study kind of adapted, or the questions were adapted to find out what was going on, whether organizational culture had changed or should change. So it was been happening very quickly, and I think there'd be an explosion of research, whether it's strategy, entrepreneurship, innovation, because we've seen kind of the best and the worst of people and organizations. Like on the emotional side, it's been amazing, well, I suppose, fields that we can go into. We're still in the middle of it. Sharman, you're talking about the aftermath. When will that be? I don't really know. Even in New Zealand, things have gone very fast from nowhere to what we call level 4, and then after 7 weeks, 3, 2, 1, and then we've seen problems here and in Australia as well, in Victoria. So I think the emotional side, the stress levels worldwide are all-time highs. So I think there's a lot of, well, stress research, and
I was thinking that actually, yeah, the focus on mental health that's coming out of this is going to have quite a profound effect that I think is going to affect us as well, working in the emotions area. On both sides of the equation, us becoming stressed and also us doing research on other people becoming stressed.
Well, I mean, like you as you sort of pointed out, just the working conditions have changed tremendously. In the UK last year, 12% of workers reported primarily working as a telecommuter or through online methods. And at the height of this COVID-19 lockdown, it was 40% here in the UK. So that's a huge change. and people sort of working just the way we are now online, when before we would have been meeting face to face, and what that's going to do to people's ability to form organizational commitment, effective commitment, these interpersonal ties with people at work, loneliness,
Frequent flyer points.
Yeah, it's going to be a
Hope you're
huge
doing so much
issue.
trouble.
On the other hand, there are some positive benefits as well. I'm enjoying not having to drive down to work. I'm enjoying spending more time with my wife, who's on furlough, getting paid for staying home. That's actually pretty good. But that can't continue long term. There are so many people worried about losing their jobs, so that, sort of like unemployment rates not seen since the Great Depression. And fortunately, the government here in the UK has been supplementing people's salaries by at least up to £2,500, about 80% of that. So it helps at least somewhat, but restarting the economy is going to be such a difficult issue, and there's so much anxiety about whether it's going to work, whether we'll be able to just pick up and go back to where we were, or if certain industry is going to be completely damaged because people won't want to go to theaters, you won't want to go to concert halls, you won't want to eat in big crowded restaurants anymore. Certainly some people are always going to want to do that. They're the people flooding to the pubs right now. Elbow to elbow. But what are people's thoughts about whether, what role that emotions research can play in helping to sort of restart the economy?
I was actually wondering if we could make it a theme. I don't know if you don't tend to have themes for Emonet, do you? Conference themes? But it's
Things are emergent.
It's almost like it should be a theme or a goal for next year's conference to focus us to make an impact.
I was thinking that with exactly that. If we've got the opportunity to rerun this year.
We will be. We will be. Hopefully, we'll be able to meet each other at Ron's place at Lancaster in 12 months' time.
Yes, we've got an extra one.
29th and 30th. Yes. Well, yeah, all right. I think that's something to consider. Yeah,
it's not mandatory, but I think it's a beacon. We have these things called beacons.
Yeah, all right. Because it is a sort of a special occasion that we'll be running this basically an extra conference. Yeah, in an odd year. We usually run the conference in odd years. No, we usually run them in even years. But we're doing an odd year conference and under these circumstances.
And I think Charmin's point that, that we've got to think about, because it's not going to be just a pandemic, as Ron said, but, that we've got to think about how do we deal with global events.
Yes, there are some broader issues. Yeah. And also we understand from the medical authorities that that we can expect events like these are going to come around maybe a bit more frequently in the future. So something we do need to think about. We've seen a succession of various pandemics coming along. This one's really taken off, but unlike the Trump administration, we won't be winding down our pandemics department. We'll be winding it up.
So
it's interesting when I was doing research on failure, and some of the papers were about the global financial crisis. Now that was, say, 10 years ago or less, which we seem to have forgotten about in some places. And there were articles on discourse and who was responsible for the failure, and attribution theory about who was attributing failure. And there were managers attributing failure to other people, other organizations, bad luck. As organizations, some were going quite well until bang, it all happened. And pretty much like a lot of politicians that we see, there were people that were deflecting the blame. Executives in banks, where a lot of that started, was saying it wasn't really their fault, and they were doing the best until there's widespread opposition, resistance to that sort of framing of who was responsible and what had caused the crisis. And here we are again, worse.
Absolutely.
So I think though, I mean, there is something that's very different about this. If we want to talk about the effect of the pandemic on the economy, the economic crisis is totally different though than the financial crisis. I mean, what we basically have is, you know, we have some sectors of the economy that have been devastated, but we have some sectors of the economy that have gone crazy nuts
like
in growth.
Like the Zoom Corporation.
Like Zoom, you know, everybody suddenly got into hand sanitizers.
Yes.
So I think it's,
Toilet
I don't
paper.
think it's quite as,
Toilet paper.
and actually what I think, I mean, to me, there's also some other things, is that what we've, like, I actually, I had this kind of thought, because a number of you know that I've been doing this large autism employment, global autism employment survey. And so I've been doing quite a lot of work around the employment of autistic people and around the world, and learned a lot of various practices and various sorts of issues and the like. And one of the things that, you know, immediately I thought about, and I was on some of the various groups that I'm part of in kind of conducting the research, and I said, you know, as it turns out, this now everybody's going to remote working. This is, you know, and everyone's saying, oh my God, how are employees going to cope? And then I'm like saying, now, isn't that ironic? Because in the pre-pandemic world, where everyone's supposed to go into an office and be able to socialize and be politically correct and do all the right stuff, autistic people tend to be very much disadvantaged. On the other hand, working remotely, and again, you can't generalize because every autistic individual's, you know, unique, but on balance, a lot of autistic individuals do that very well. They don't have that, actually, that is not, they don't, a lot of them don't need the high levels of social contact and all of these sorts of things. So I actually thought it's kind of interesting, because it highlights that, in fact, again, if you want to talk about contextual variables, there's an entire subpopulation, a large subpopulation and a large growing subpopulation globally that is effectively disadvantaged by the way our current organizations, you know, sort of run and put so much emphasis on, you know, how good are we at having chats around the water cooler kind of thing, and hanging out with folks. And so this is, to me, has been also very interesting in kind of highlighting something like that. So I think, to me, that there's a lot of, you know, there's the worrisome stuff that we, of course, have to address, but there's also some opportunities in this to try to drag organizations out of the industrial age, the command and controls, you know, surveillance leadership sort of notions, into what most of us researchers in organization studies have been trying to get organizations to do to work very differently with people. And to me, there's potentially an opportunity to try to get some of the changes for organizations to do some of the things that they should have been doing differently for a very long time. Like, why does it take a pandemic to suddenly get managers to worry about the loneliness or the well-being of their coworkers? That should have always been on the agenda. It's not like that didn't just happen because we have a pandemic. We've always had that issue. There's always been stuff like that. So I guess what I'm trying to say is, you know, it would be great if we can somehow try to, you know, be part of sort of, I guess, kind of, you know, sort of research, knowledge generation, dissemination efforts that try to steer organizations as they come out of this thing into adopting, you know, much more progressive ideas around, you know, work and managing workers and all of these things.
That's an excellent point. I think if we can use this as an opportunity to shape the public discussion about how to handle the situation and suggest, you know, positive leadership and management practices. And the COVID-19 anxiety paper that I'm writing now is sort of billed as a policy paper, you know, for what can governments and businesses do to help people cope with it. I'm not a medical doctor, so I can't talk about vaccines or whatever, but if we can sort of guide the strategy for how businesses and governments help handle reopening the economy and managing the new working relationships to be a more empathic and emotionally intelligent leadership style and management style, I think there'll be a huge contribution.
Sounds like a great note to finish up on. Because we do have another session starting in a while, and I've got to grab a little bit of dinner time here now. So and the footy's starting in a while anyway. So that was a great discussion. That's the more
important thing. The football's starting.
So it was an excellent discussion. Thanks very much, everybody, for joining in. We'll certainly carry forward that idea of perhaps having a theme. Ashley, Ron, and I will discuss that as we move forward. The call for papers for the Emonet 13 for next year will be out shortly, but we've got a meeting on Monday, and we'll discuss maybe moving forward on that idea. Okay, well, that's about it for now. We have a second plenary in the UK this evening. In Australia here, it'll be in the morning, and I suppose in North America, it'll be some other different time.
6 p.m.
If you get a chance to join in that one, but we're got 2 more paper sessions to go. If you can join them, please do so. Anne will be chairing one, and Chao Miao will be chairing the second. So thanks very much, everybody, for participating and joining in. Have a great day / evening / morning wherever you are, and I look forward to seeing you more in the future. So I'm just going to stop the recording.